When I was very young, my father taught me about a man named Martin Niemöller. When I was very young, my father taught me about a man named Martin Niemöller. I didn't realize it at the time, and I'm not sure if he realized it either, but this was a gift of wisdom, and I've used it throughout my entire life. When I was very young, my father taught me about a man named Martin Niemöller. I didn't realize it at the time, and I don't think my dad did either, but this was a gift of wisdom, and I've used it throughout my entire life since. When I was very young, my father taught me about a man named Martin Niemöller, and I didn't realize it at the time, and I certainly don't think my dad did either, but this was the gift of wisdom that I was given. Oops. When I was very young, my father taught me about a man named Martin Niemöller. I didn't realize it at the time, and I don't think he did either, but this was a gift of wisdom, and I've used it throughout my entire life. Martin Niemöller was a German theologian and a Lutheran pastor. Martin Niemöller was a German theologian and a Lutheran pastor. Martin Niemöller was a German theologian and a Lutheran pastor. He started out as a German nationalist. He started out as a German nationalist supporting Hitler. He started out as a German nationalist and a supporter of Hitler. There were a few things that Martin didn't agree with. There were a few areas in Hitler's political party that Martin didn't agree with. And after some time passed, he began to slowly see the hatred, the propaganda, and the lies. Now, Martin Niemöller didn't agree with everything Hitler had to say. And Martin Niemöller didn't agree with everything Hitler had to say. And over time, Martin Niemöller didn't agree with everything that Martin Niemöller didn't agree with everything on Hitler's political party platform. And over time, he slowly began to see the hatred, the propaganda, the lies, and the vilification. Niemöller didn't believe in everything that Hitler's political party believed in. There were a few things that Martin Niemöller didn't agree with. There were parts of Hitler's political party that Martin Niemöller didn't completely agree with. And over time, there were parts of Hitler's political party that Martin Niemöller didn't agree with, and over time, there were parts of there were parts of there were parts of come on, Kim. There were parts of Hitler's political party that Martin Niemöller didn't completely agree with, and over time, he began to slowly see the hatred, the propaganda, the lies, and the vilification that was going on. But it was too late. 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 Hitler's regime had taken over, and it was too dangerous. But it was too late. But it was all too late. But it was too late. Hitler's regime had taken over, and they were powerful and too dangerous. Too powerful. But it was too late. Hitler's regime had taken over, and they were too powerful and too dangerous. But it was too late. But it was too late. But it was too late. Hitler's regime had taken over, and they were too powerful and too dangerous. He'd watched and done nothing, and now it was too late. He'd watched and done nothing, and now it was too late. Niemöller was jailed by Hitler and was considered an enemy. Niemöller was jailed by Hitler and was considered an enemy of the state. And I'm guessing his time. Niemöller was jailed by Hitler, and Niemöller was jailed by Hitler and considered an enemy of the state. And I'm guessing he spent a lot of time thinking in his jail cell. Niemöller was eventually jailed by the. Niemöller was eventually put in prison by Hitler and considered an enemy of the state. And I'm guessing during his time in prison, he had a lot of time to think. Martin Niemöller was jailed by Hitler and considered an enemy of the state. I'm guessing that in prison, he had a lot of time to think. Finally, Niemöller was imprisoned by Hitler and was considered an enemy of the state. Today, Martin Niemöller is best known for his opposition to the Nazi regime during the late 1930s and for his widely known quote in 1946, referred to as "First They Came." Today, he's best known for his staunch opposition to the Nazi Party, and today he is known for his staunch opposition to the Nazi Party during the late 1930s and for his widely quoted 1946 poem that's referred to as "First They Came." The poem exists in many versions, and later he recited the verses to his university students, probably in hopes that they would learn vicariously the lessons that he was too late. The poem exists in many versions today. The poem exists in many versions today. Later in life, Niemöller would recite the verses to his university students, probably with the hopes that they would learn vicariously what he was not able to learn in time. Later in life, he'd recite this poem to his university students in various Later in life, Niemöller would recite this poem to his university students in various versions, probably with the hopes that they would learn vicariously he was too late to stop. Later in life, Niemöller would recite these verses with the hopes that maybe they and be able to Later in life, Niemöller would recite these verses to his university students, probably with the hopes that they would somehow learn vicariously and not make the same mistakes he made. Here's how his poem went. First, they came for the communists, and I didn't speak out because I was not a communist. Then they came for the trade unionists. I didn't speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews. I didn't speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. When we talk about the Holocaust, we're talking about a time when Hitler and his Nazi party exterminated 6 million human beings, men, women, and children who were Jewish, by starving, working them to death, and by stripping them naked and showering them with poison gas until they choked to death. Most people know about this. Most people know all about this. Most people know all about this crime against humanity. So you might wonder, what does this poem So you may wonder what my big connection is with this poem. So you may wonder what my big connection's been with this poem for so long. Hey, I'm videoing.
Soup smells great.
It does? Yay. I'm in the middle of a
Okay. Talking to someone?
no, I'm videoing, making a video.
Okay.
I'm gonna let her sleep. She's fucking exhausted.
Yeah. I didn't even know you were home.
Oh, because you were talking to the lady, and I was like, oh, I didn't want to interrupt. The lady and the man? Like a happy hour or something?
Oh, yeah, it was a whole. Yeah, that's somebody must have been talking. Yeah, there was about 40 people on the call. I was like, lady. Yeah,
I just heard some lady telling about her kids. My kids,
they do social things like that.
That was funny. It sounded like a happy hour. I could have been wrong.
Yeah. No, it's good. I mean, it keeps people.
I think that's awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah,
everybody sort of gets along. That's cool.
Everyone's like, they've got such great people. They got such amazing people. I love that. I freaking love it. So happy for you.
He organized it at 4 p.m.
Ooh, nothing like the last minute. Everyone's
no.
Oh, out of here.
It was at 4 p.m. So people were drinking at 4 p.m.
Oh, so you're drunk?
No.
Okay. Yeah, I'm gonna finish this and I'll come down. I'm just I'll let her sleep. It'll just be us. I'm sure she'll stay home too. I gotta tell you some stories.
He's gonna vomit.
Take him out of here. Want to shut my door so I can keep videoing?
Right, I'll lock him in.
No, well, I mean,
Okay.
yeah. I mean, you can keep it open, I guess. I don't know. Okay. You may wonder why this poem means You may wonder why this poem means so much to me today. Well, you may wonder why this poem means so much to me still today. Well, I love teaching hidden history. I have a huge interest in hidden history. Did you know that the Nazis You may wonder what the brutal murder of 6 million Jewish people and Martin Niemöller's poem have to do with me today. Well, first of all, I love hidden history. It's a huge interest of mine. Hidden history is a huge interest of mine. Did you know that the Nazis Did you know that Jewish people weren't the only people that the Nazis murdered and tortured? Did you know that Jewish people aren't the only people that the Nazis tortured and murdered? Did you know that the Nazis did more than just murder and barbaric? Did you know that the Nazis did more than the barbaric? Did you know that Did you know that Hitler and the Nazis? Did you know that Hitler and his Nazi regime did more than just barbarically? Did you know that Hitler and his Nazi regime? Did you know that Hitler and his Nazi regime did even more than the barbaric torture and murder of 6 million Jewish people? Most people don't realize this, and this is what I'm getting at. Most people don't realize this. This is going to be hard to believe. It's hard to believe that the torture and murder of 6 million Jewish people wasn't the only thing that Hitler did to our fellow humans. It's hard to believe it. It's hard to believe that Hitler and his Nazi regime tortured 6 million Jewish people. It's hard to believe that Hitler and his regime tortured 6 million Jewish people. And there's a lot of hidden history. It's barbaric to think of how Hitler murdered. It's barbaric to think. It's so painful to think about how Hitler and his regime murdered 6 million Jews. It's barbaric. It's painful to think about how Hitler and his regime barbarically murdered 6 million Jewish people. But there's more. He also tortured, murdered, and maimed many other groups of people that throughout history. He also tortured, murdered, and maimed a number of other groups that throughout history And throughout history, their stories have. He also he also tortured, murdered, and maimed a number of groups of people. He also tortured, murdered, and maimed large numbers of other groups of people. And throughout history, their stories have all but been lost. I'm not telling you this to I'm not telling you this to play who was I'm not telling you this to play who was harmed most, or I'm not telling you this so you can decide who had the worst treatment. I'm not telling you this to decide who had the worst treatment or to compare, because there are no comparisons to crimes against humanity. They all stand alone. I'm not telling you this so you can compare who was tortured the most or murdered the most. I'm not telling you this so you can compare who was tortured or murdered the most. I'm telling you this because this has all but been forgotten at many, many groups of other people. I'm not telling you this to compare. I'm not telling you this so you can compare barbaric treatment. I'm telling you this so you understand our real racial history. Groups like Black people, um, groups like Black people, Afro-Germans, groups like Afro-Germans, and other Black people, what he referred to. Hitler and his regime murdered and maimed groups like German. Hitler and his regime murdered and maimed groups like Afro-Germans, Black people, and now this refers to an antiquated group. And what he referred to back then, which is now an antiquated. Hitler's Nazi regime murdered German. Hitler's Nazi regime murdered Afro. Hitler's Nazi regime murdered Black Germans. He murdered what was Hitler and his Nazi regime murdered Black Germans. He also murdered people that were referred to now in an antiquated. He also murdered people now referred to as. Hitler and his regime murdered Black Germans, and he also murdered a group of people that. Hitler murdered Black Germans, and he also murdered a group of people that we now refer to in an antiquated. Hitler and his regime murdered Black Germans, and he also. Hitler and his regime murdered and maimed Black Germans, and he also harmed was referred to then and is now antiquated. Hitler and his regime murdered Black Germans, And he also harmed what was referred to in the past and is now very antiquated and a racial slur, what he called gypsies. He harmed Hitler and his regime murdered and maimed Black Germans, and he also Hitler and his regime murdered and maimed Black people and a group that he used to call gypsy. Hitler and his regime murdered and maimed Black people. Hitler and his regime murdered and maimed Black people. He also Hitler and his regime murdered and maimed Black Germans. He also did Hitler and his regime murdered and maimed Black Germans, and also people who were called, I should just write this out, Jesus. Hitler and his regime murdered Black Germans, and he also Hitler and his regime murdered Black Germans and a group referred to and is now Hitler and his regime murdered Black Germans, and he referred to Hitler and his regime murdered Black Germans and a group he referred to and is now an antiquated slur, gypsies. Hitler and with disabilities and children and gay men. He also harmed a group that is referred to and he also harmed a group that is now referred to in a very he also harmed a group he referred to and is now a very antiquated. He also murdered and maimed a group that he referred to and is now he also murdered and maimed a group he referred to at the time, and it's now an antiquated racial slur, as gypsies. Hitler and his regime murdered thousands and thousands of Black Germans, Russian and Polish prisoners of war, anyone with a disability, including hundreds of children, homosexual men, and also a group he referred to, and it's now considered an antiquated racial slur, gypsies. Hitler Hitler and his regime murdered. Come on, Kim. Hitler and his regime murdered and maimed groups of Black Germans, Russian, Polish prisoners of war, children and adults with disabilities, homosexual men, poor people, trade unionists, communists, and a group which he referred to in a way that's now considered an antiquated slur, gypsies. But this didn't happen overnight. It happened slowly over time until it was normalized. But this didn't happen overnight. It happened slowly over time until it was normalized. But this didn't happen overnight. This happened slowly over time till it was normalized. And then it was too late. It had become too powerful. And so you can see the same pattern. Can you see the same pattern happening here in the United States? Can you see the same pattern happening here in the United States? We're in the twilight of our democracy. Now, this didn't happen in Germany overnight. It took years and years until it was finally normalized, and then it was too powerful a force to do anything about. So, can you see the same thing that's happening here in the United States? We're in the twilight of our democracy. So, it's incredibly important that today we recognize the 76th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. So today, it's incredibly important that we mark the 76th anniversary of the freeing and liberation of Auschwitz concentration camp. Today is Holocaust Remembrance Day. Today is Holocaust Remembrance Day. Today is the 76th. Today is the 76th Holocaust Remembrance Day, a day that we mark as today marks the 76th Holocaust Remembrance Day. Today marks the 76th Holocaust Remembrance Day, a day when Today marks the 76th anniversary. Today marks the 76th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz concentration camp. Today across the world, today is Holocaust Remembrance Day. It marks the 76th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz concentration camp. It's imperative that we see the atrocities done to people of the Jewish faith, and all the other groups. It is imperative that we learn the history of the horrendous atrocities done to the people of Jewish faith and all the other groups. Many of the non-Jewish people were murdered, but many of the non-Jewish people were murdered. Many of the non-Jewish people were murdered just like the Jewish people were. Many of the non-Jewish groups of people were murdered just like the Jewish people were, but others were not. Instead, they were tortured, sterilized, experimented on, thrown out of the country, harassed, beat up, thrown into impoverished, what they call ghettos, to die, or starved. Instead, they were tortured, sterilized, experimented on, thrown out of the country, beaten up and harassed, thrown into the impoverished, poor sections of the country so that they would starve to death. Listen to these numbers. Approximately 15,000 gay men were murdered. Others were imprisoned, beat up, harassed, sterilized, starved to death, or re-educated. 15,000 gay men were murdered. 15,000 gay men were murdered. Approximately 15,000 gay men were murdered. And that's not counting the people who were kept alive, imprisoned, beat up, harassed, re-educated, sterilized, and starved. During the war, Nazi ran a children's euthanasia program where 5,000 children with various disabilities were secretly murdered, most of them by lethal injection or starvation. Its adult equivalent began the winter of 1939 and expanded existing. Its adult equivalent started in 1939. By the time it was shut down due to public outcry, 70,000 disabled adults had been murdered, euthanized by their own people. $3.3 million Soviet prisoners of war were murdered by the Nazi regime. 3.3 million Soviet prisoners of war were murdered by the Nazi regime in extermination camps. 3.3 million Soviet prisoners were exterminated while in Nazi prisons. 3.3 million Soviets who were prisoners of war were exterminated by the Nazi regime. 3.3 million Soviet prisoners of war. 3.3 million Soviet prisoners of war were murdered by the Nazi regime. – from somewhere between 190,000 and 250,000 Roma and Sinti. It's the antiquated word they used as 190,000 to 190,000, somewhere between 190,000 to 250,000 gypsies, somewhere between 190,000 to 250,000 Roma and Sinti, what Hitler would refer to as no meowing. No meowing. There's no meowing. No meowing. Oh, no meowing, no meowing, no meowing. Okay. Between 190,000 and 250,000 Romas and Sintis, what was antiquatedly referred to as gypsies, were murdered in gas chamber, starvation, imprisoned, and sterilization. At least 1.8 million non-Jewish Polish people were murdered by the regime. So what does all this hidden history have to do with Martin Niemöller's poem? So what does all this hidden history have to do with Martin Niemöller's poem and So what does all this hidden history have to do with Martin Niemöller's poem and how much it means to me? Let me read it one more time for you. First, they came for the communists. I didn't speak out because I wasn't a communist. Next, they came for the trade unionists. I wasn't a trade unionist, and I didn't speak out. First, they came for the communists, and I didn't speak out because I wasn't a communist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I didn't speak out because I wasn't a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I didn't speak out because I wasn't a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. Martin Niemöller wrote this poem in remorse for not acting. Martin Niemöller recited this poem in remorse for not having acted faster. Martin Niemöller wrote this poem with remorse for not having responded to what he saw before his very eyes. He finally did, but it was too late. Martin Niemöller wrote this poem with horrific regret for not having acted sooner on what he was watching before his very eyes. I really took that to heart. I've taken his wisdom to heart. And I've taken his wisdom to heart. And I can't help but feel like history is repeating. I've taken his wisdom to heart my entire life. And I've taken his wisdom to heart my entire life by always standing up for others when human and civil rights are being violated. But I think it's too late. I see it happening in the United States. I can't help but feel like today in the United States, Martin Niemöller's poem is lost to history. Bootsy! Bootsy! Come here, baby. Okay. So what does Martin Niemöller's poem have to do with me? So what does Martin Niemöller's poem have to do with the Holocaust? So what does Martin Niemöller's poem have to do with me today? So what does Martin Niemöller's poem have to do with us today in the United States? I feel like his poem has been lost to history. I feel like we're repeating all that he warned us about. I feel like we're ignoring all that he warned us about, and we're allowing history to repeat. I feel like Martin Niemöller's poem has been lost to history, and we're simply repeating all that he warned us about. I feel like we're repeating everything Martin Niemöller warned us about. It's just been lost to history. I've been watching in the United States, and we're doing exactly what he spoke of. We're only standing up if our group's being impacted. By then, it's too late. If you believe, like I do, that it is way past time for white America to start taking racial responsibility, please consider subscribing to my YouTube channel and my other platforms. I do live shows each Wednesday at 9 p.m. Eastern. They're participatory. I do live shows each Wednesday night at 9 p.m. Eastern from my Facebook page and my YouTube channel called Angry Soccer Mom. Please consider joining in the fight, because it might not be your group this time. Please consider joining in the fight. Please consider joining in the fight for equity and justice for all in the United States. It's part of forming a more perfect union, because you see, it might not be your group this time, but when human and civil rights are violated for other groups, when human and civil rights are systemically violated for other groups, it's just a matter of time until your group's next. Thanks for watching. Oh my God, what a night.